The Kane private jet touched down on the runway just after sunrise. The morning light spilled through the windows, painting Priska's cheeks in soft gold as she leaned into Alexander's shoulder, her eyes still heavy with sleep. He didn't wake her. He simply held her close, his hand resting protectively over the gentle curve of her belly. They had spent the past 3 weeks traveling across hidden islands and romantic cities, yet the look on Alexander's face wasn't the satisfaction of a man who had checked another luxury off his list. It was the quiet joy of a man who finally understood what it meant to come home, no matter where he was in the world, as long as she was beside him. The moment they stepped onto the tarmac, the flashes began. Paparazzi had gotten word of their return, and lenses followed their every move. Alexander ignored them. If anything, he seemed to relish the chance to walk proudly with his wife's hand in his head held high. When one photographer shouted a question about the pregnancy rumors, Alexander glanced sideways at Priska, his lips twitching into a smile. "Let them wonder," he murmured, leaning close enough that only she could hear. Back at Kane International headquarters the following Monday, the transformation was impossible to miss. The man who once moved through the building like a storm, silent, distant, untouchable, now stopped to greet people in the hallway. He asked about their weekends. He smiled. "Good morning, Jonathan. How's your daughter doing with her piano lessons?" "Melissa, that presentation you worked on, brilliant. Truly brilliant." His scar was still there, running in that jagged line from cheek to jaw, but it no longer seemed to define him. The guarded eyes that once warned the world to keep its distance now carried warmth, as though a locked door had been thrown open. The whispers started almost immediately. "Have you seen him lately? He's actually happy. Marriage looks good on him. They weren't wrong." Every time his phone lit up with Priska's name, Alexander's entire expression shifted. If she called during a meeting, he would excuse himself without hesitation, no matter who was in the room. It was unheard of before, but no one dared challenge him. It wasn't only in the office that Alexander's newfound openness showed. At a charity gala the following week, Alexander arrived with Priska on his arm. She wore a champagne silk gown that shimmered with every step, and the diamond comb in her hair caught the chandelier light, scattering it in tiny bursts. As soon as they entered the ballroom, the room turned to look. Some with admiration, others with curiosity, a few with envy. Alexander didn't rush them to a corner table. No. He led Priska through the crowd, pausing at every conversation circle to introduce her. "This is my wife, Priska Kane," he would say, with the same pride another man might use to introduce a Lifetime Achievement Award. When an oil magnate tried to monopolize Alexander's attention, he redirected the conversation. "You should be speaking with Priska," Alexander said. "She has a perspective on environmental preservation and photography you'd find fascinating." She blushed, but didn't shrink back. They were a team, and the world could see it. Back in his office later that week, Alexander sat at the head of the long, sleek boardroom table. His executives were mid-discussion about a major merger, voices low with caution. "What's your view, Kane?" one of the directors asked. Alexander glanced to the chair beside him, where Priska sat, flipping through the documents he'd given her that morning. "I think we should hear my wife's thoughts," Alexander said simply. A ripple of surprise moved around the table. This was Kane International, where decisions were made with military precision, not romantic consultation. But Priska spoke, her voice calm, steady, and insightful. She pointed out a cultural branding misalignment that none of the seasoned executives had noticed. When the meeting ended, Alexander caught the subtle nods of approval from the board members. He didn't say, "I told you so." He didn't have to. Despite the new openness with the world, Alexander reserved his most intimate warmth for the moments only they shared. On Friday evening, Priska walked into his office to find a small box on her chair. Inside was a silver locket, engraved with their wedding date. Inside the locket, a tiny candid photo from their honeymoon, her laughing, wind in her hair. taken by him when she wasn't looking. "You always see me," she whispered, touched. "That's because you've always seen me," he replied. That night, instead of going home in separate cars, they drove together, his hand resting on hers the entire way. At a red light, he turned to her with that boyish smile that still caught her off guard. "You know," he said softly, "I used to think love was a distraction. Now I know it's the reason." The next week, they attended a business dinner hosted by a tech partner. Priska wore a simple black dress, her hair swept back to reveal her radiant face. Alexander didn't let her sit quietly in the background. He brought her into conversations, laughed at her witty remarks, and listened intently when she spoke. At one point, another CEO's wife leaned over and whispered to Priska, "You're very lucky. My husband never looks at me the way yours looks at you." Priska smiled politely, but inside, she knew it wasn't luck. It was love, built on truth. Of course, not everyone celebrated their happiness. Some women who had once turned Alexander down, back when the scar was all they saw, now watched with quiet regret. They had judged too quickly, assumed too much. And now they saw the way he treated his wife, with loyalty, tenderness, and an almost old-fashioned respect. They saw him leave meetings early to make it to a prenatal appointment. They saw him bring her tea at events, pull out her chair, open her door, and look at her as though she was the only person in the room. And for a moment they wished they'd seen then what Priska had seen all along. Late one night, Alexander and Priska sat on the balcony of their penthouse. The city stretched out below them, alive with lights and motion. Priska's head rested against his chest, his hand splayed protectively over her growing belly. "You've changed," she said softly, her voice half asleep. He kissed her hair. "No, you changed me. And I'm never going back." She looked up at him, eyes warm. "Good. Because I like you this way." Alexander smiled, the scar catching the moonlight, but no longer dimming it. "Then this is the man I'll be. For you, for our child, for the rest of my life." And for the first time in years, the man who once lived behind walls didn't just feel happy. He felt free. The ribbon fluttered to the ground in a swirl of scarlet silk. Priska stood at the threshold of the new building, her eyes wide as she took in the gleaming glass facade and the gold-plated letters that spelled her name across the entrance. Priska Kane Photography Studios. It didn't matter that she had been to the site dozens of times during its construction. Seeing it complete, with the chandeliers glowing inside and the grand double doors thrown open in welcome, still made her breath catch. Alexander stood beside her, one arm loosely around her waist, his other hand resting on her slightly rounded stomach. He was smiling in that quiet, satisfied way of his, the kind of smile that told her he wasn't thinking about the money he had spent but about her face in this moment. "You built me this?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Not just for you," he replied softly, leaning close so that only she could hear. "For us. For your vision. You've given me the world, Priska. It's time I gave you one of your own." The interior looked like something from a design magazine. A grand reception area with cream marble floors reflected the warm golden light from oversized crystal chandeliers. Plush ivory couches sat against the walls, with vases of fresh orchids on every table. The air smelled faintly of vanilla and white roses. Down a hallway, there were two expansive photo studios, one with tall, arched windows that poured in natural sunlight, and another with every possible professional lighting setup a photographer could dream of. There was a styling suite complete with racks of couture gowns, makeup stations with lit mirrors, and even a private lounge for VIP clients. "Alexander," Priska whispered, turning to him in disbelief. "This is beyond anything I could have imagined." He took her hands, his eyes locked on hers. "You imagined me into a better man. This is the easy part." That night, when she returned home after walking through every inch of her new studio, Alexander was waiting for her in the kitchen with another surprise, a small white gift box tied with a black satin ribbon. Inside, she found a Leica camera, limited edition, engraved with her initials in gold. "I wanted you to have the very best tool for your craft," he said. "But more than that, I wanted it to be yours in every sense." Priska threw her arms around him, laughing through the tears that blurred her vision. From that day on, Alexander seemed to take pleasure in finding new ways to surprise her. Sometimes it was something small. A note slipped into her handbag before a meeting, written in his bold, precise handwriting. "You're the most beautiful part of my day." Other times it was grand, like the morning he asked her to clear her schedule, then whisked her away on a private helicopter to a hidden cliffside resort for lunch. One rainy afternoon, he walked into her studio with a large, flat package wrapped in brown paper. Inside was a vintage black and white photograph of a Paris street scene, the very one she had admired in a gallery years ago but never bought because it was too extravagant. "How did you even find this?" she asked, tracing the frame with her fingers. "I make a habit of remembering the things you love," he said simply. Alexander's devotion to her wasn't just visible at home. It had become part of his business life. When they attended corporate functions together, people noticed how often he deferred to her opinion, how naturally he included her in every conversation. During a crucial board meeting about expanding into a new international market, Alexander didn't make the final call until he had asked, "Priska, what's your take on this?" Some executives exchanged puzzled looks. It wasn't common for a billionaire CEO to consult his wife on high-stakes corporate deals. But Alexander didn't care. "She has a way of seeing the human side of things that we sometimes overlook," he explained, his tone leaving no room for argument. The world noticed their closeness, and so did the women who had once rejected Alexander. At a charity luncheon, two women from his past stood at a corner table, pretending to study the floral arrangements while whispering. "I didn't think he'd ever marry," one said, her voice tinged with regret. "Not after—" "Well, you know," the other replied, making a vague gesture toward her own cheek. "But look at him now." They watched as Alexander helped Priska into her chair, poured her water himself instead of waiting for a server, and leaned in to listen when she spoke, as if the rest of the room had vanished. "I could have been sitting in that chair," one muttered under her breath. But they hadn't seen what Priska had seen. And now, the chance was gone. Alexander's gifts weren't just expensive, they were personal. One evening, he handed her a long velvet box. Inside lay a delicate gold bracelet with two tiny charms, one shaped like a camera, the other like a little heart. "For the day you made me see," he said, fastening it around her wrist. Another time, he gave her a leather-bound journal embossed with her initials. On the first page, he had written, "Write our story as it happens, so when we're old we can read it together and remember every moment." Priska pressed the journal to her chest, tears pricking her eyes. "Alexander, you're going to spoil me beyond repair." "That's the plan," he said, smiling. As the months passed, Priska's pregnancy began to show. She glowed in a way that made strangers smile when they passed her on the street. Alexander became even more protective, walking her to her car himself, insisting on carrying her bags and personally tasting dishes before she did at restaurants. At night, he would read to her, not because she needed the information, but because he wanted their children to hear his voice. One evening, as they sat on the couch with her head in his lap, he looked down at her belly and said softly, "I don't know who they'll take after more, you or me, but I hope they get your heart." Despite all the success, all the luxury, Alexander never forgot where he had been before Priska. There were still days when he caught his reflection unexpectedly and was momentarily transported back to the years when all he saw was the scar. But then she would appear, sometimes with a camera slung over her shoulder, sometimes with paint on her hands from a creative project, and he would remember. She had seen him whole before he could see himself. That knowledge became the foundation of every gift, every gesture, every look. On the evening of the studio's official grand opening, Alexander stood in the crowd, his gaze fixed on Priska as she moved gracefully from guest to guest. She laughed easily, her hand occasionally brushing her belly, her eyes bright. When she finally reached him, he took her hands in front of everyone and said, "You once told me I was hiding behind walls. I want you to know, those walls are gone, and they're never coming back." Priska smiled, her eyes glistening. "Good, because I like this view better." And as the applause filled the room, Alexander felt certain of one thing. Every gift he had given her, every surprise, every gesture, was only the beginning. The first signs came on a quiet Sunday morning in late spring. The air was warm, the sunlight poured through the curtains, and Alexander was halfway through making breakfast, his version of breakfast, which meant an entire counter filled with pastries, fresh fruit, and 3 different kinds of tea for Priska, when she suddenly placed a hand on her stomach and froze. "Alexander," she said, her voice a mix of wonder and surprise. He was at her side instantly. "What? What's wrong?" She took his hand and placed it gently where hers had been. "I think they just kicked." For a moment, Alexander didn't move. Then his eyes widened and softened all at once. The faint flutter beneath his palm wasn't much, but it was enough to make his throat tighten. "They're saying hello," he murmured. Priska laughed, leaning into his embrace. "Or telling you they want some of that chocolate croissant." From that moment, everything shifted into an even higher gear of anticipation. The nursery had already been in the planning stages, but Alexander threw himself into it like it was his most important business deal. One wing of their home was transformed into a dreamy sanctuary. Soft white walls with golden accents, 2 identical cribs carved with delicate vines, and a ceiling painted like a twilight sky with tiny glowing stars. He even commissioned a custom mural showing a whimsical cityscape, with 2 little girls in matching dresses walking hand in hand through it. When Priska teased him about going overboard, he only shrugged. "Overboard is the only way to love someone," he said. At work, Alexander's warmth became almost legendary. His once intimidating office, which used to be all sleek black and steel, now had framed sonogram pictures on his desk and a vase of fresh flowers that he insisted kept the air feeling alive. His employees noticed the change. Where he had once been efficient but distant, he was now quick with a smile, generous with praise, and patient in a way that surprised even him. Colleagues who had known him for years whispered about it in the hallways. Marriage suits him. No, she suits him. If there was an event, a meeting, a gala, Priska was there beside him, and Alexander made sure everyone knew she wasn't just his wife, but his partner. At a high-profile charity auction, he interrupted the host's introduction to say, "I should warn you, any compliments on my suit go to my wife." She picked it. At a corporate award ceremony, when he was honored for his achievements, he spent the majority of his acceptance speech talking about how Priska taught him that true wealth is in the love you share, not the fortune you hold. And every time, he would glance at her with that proud, almost boyish smile, the one that seemed to say, "I can't believe she's mine." It didn't escape anyone's notice, least of all the women who had once dismissed him, that Alexander Kane was the most attentive husband in any room. Some of them had to admit in private moments they'd never speak aloud, that they had misjudged him. The scar that had once made them hesitate now seemed like the faintest line on a masterpiece. What they had missed wasn't just the man's fortune. It was the depth of his loyalty, his quiet strength, and the way he treated the woman he loved as if she were the most precious thing in the world. Throughout her pregnancy, Alexander spoiled Priska with both big gestures and small ones. There were afternoons when he'd appear at her studio with her favorite gelato, just because it was sunny. There were evenings when he'd run her a bath scented with lavender, light candles around the room, and sit nearby reading aloud while she soaked. Once, when she mentioned craving a pastry from a cafe she loved in Paris, he didn't hesitate. The next day she found a box from that very cafe waiting in their kitchen, flown in fresh. "It's just a croissant," she teased, though her eyes shone. "It's never just anything when it's for you," he replied. It happened in the middle of the night. Priska woke to a deep, twisting pain, followed by another. She shook Alexander awake, and in seconds he was up, dressed, and calling their doctor. At the hospital, everything moved quickly. Alexander stayed right by her side, holding her hand through every contraction, whispering encouragement, brushing her hair back when it clung to her forehead. When the first tiny cry filled the room, his eyes filled instantly. He kissed Priska's forehead and murmured, "She's perfect. You're perfect." Minutes later, the second cry came, slightly softer, but just as beautiful. The nurse placed both swaddled girls into Priska's arms, and Alexander looked down at them as if the universe had just handed him its most precious secret. One had a tuft of dark hair like Priska's, and the other a softer brown like his own. Both had tiny fists that occasionally waved in the air, as if they were already declaring their presence to the world. "What should we name them?" Priska asked, her voice tired but glowing. Alexander had been prepared for this. "Sophia Grace. And Isabella Rose," he said softly. Priska's smile deepened. "Perfect." The weeks that followed were a blur of soft blankets, midnight feedings, and the kind of exhaustion that came with a sweetness all its own. Alexander learned to swaddle with the precision of an engineer. He became an expert at balancing both girls in his arms while pacing the nursery, humming softly. Sometimes Priska would wake in the night to find him sitting in the rocker, one daughter sleeping against his chest, the other curled in the crook of his arm, his head resting back as he dozed. The first public photo of the twins was taken on the day of Alexander's company's summer gala. He and Priska attended with the girls in matching pale pink dresses and tiny white shoes. The photo, which quickly went viral, showed Alexander holding both daughters, smiling in a way that was so open and unguarded it made headlines. Billionaire CEO melts hearts with family moment. To him, it wasn't a performance. It was simply his life now. On their first anniversary, Alexander presented Priska with something she never expected, a leather-bound album filled with photographs he had taken himself over the past year. It began with pictures from their honeymoon, then the studio opening, her pregnancy glow, the hospital, the first days at home with the twins, and finally, the four of them together in the garden, the girls giggling in their parents' arms. On the last page, in his handwriting, were the words, "This is our forever. Thank you for seeing me before I saw myself. I'll spend the rest of my life showing you that you chose right." Years later, when people spoke of Alexander Kane, they no longer mentioned his scar first. They talked about the man who built an empire without losing his soul, who loved his wife openly, who carried his daughters on his shoulders at company picnics, who made every woman in his life feel valued. But to Alexander, none of that mattered as much as the quiet evenings at home, when Priska would curl up beside him, the girls asleep upstairs, and he could look at her and think, "This is the life I never dared to dream of, and somehow, it's mine." The night air was soft, carrying the scent of jasmine from the garden below. Inside, the twins slept soundly in their matching cribs, tiny chests rising and falling in unison. Out on the balcony, Alexander stood with Priska in his arms, the city lights stretching out like a jeweled blanket beneath them. He pressed his lips to her temple and whispered, "You gave me a life worth living." Priska's fingers curled gently against his shirt. She tilted her head, meeting his gaze with eyes that had never wavered from him. Not when the world judged him, not when he doubted himself. "And you gave me the love I never thought I'd find." For a moment, they simply stood there, swaying to the quiet rhythm of the night, letting the truth of those words sink in. Somewhere beyond the city skyline, the stars shimmered faintly, tiny witnesses to a promise they'd been living every day since the moment they chose each other. The next afternoon, the Kane family was in their garden, the twins tumbling on a blanket while Alexander and Priska laughed nearby. The late summer sun cast everything in gold, the flowers, the grass, their hair, the sparkle in their eyes. Alexander scooped both girls into his arms, their giggles spilling into the warm air. Priska leaned into his side, her smile bright enough to rival the sunset. It wasn't the empire he'd built, or the fortune he'd earned that made Alexander Kane a rich man. It was this laughter, this love, this family. And as the day melted into twilight, they stood together in that golden hour, knowing it wasn't just the end of a beautiful day. It was the beginning of every tomorrow they'd share. Thank you so much for watching and supporting my channel. Your love, comments, and shares mean everything to me. Grateful for each of you. Let's keep growing together. With love from Whispers of Hope.